Okay, 3, 2, 1, it's jam.
What's up, science fam? We know that plants are capable of doing stuff like photosynthesis, making their own food, making oxygen. We know plants are important in general. But how do these things that can't really move around survive in a world where everything wants to kill them or eat them, especially vegans? So this is what we're going to talk about for this session. My name is Sir Ramon and welcome to Science with Sir Ramon. So our topic is about plants, their structures, their growth, and their development. So we're going to talk about their cells, which progress into plant tissues, that progress into plant organs. So in order to talk about that, again, we're going to talk about the structures, growth, and development of the plants and their roles for each structure. So what are we up to? We're going to discuss the parts and functions involved in reproduction, development, nutrition, gas exchange, transport, circulation, chemical nervous control, and sensory and motor mechanisms of plants. So pretty much everything. This is basically a crash course in botany. Let's do this, right? So these are the basic plant organs. This is the anatomy of a plant. We have two things that we call the root and the shoot system. The shoot system is basically anything above ground, and the root system is anything below ground. So particularly in your shoot system, we have the flower, the reproductive organ. We have the leaves, the photosynthetic organ, which includes the blade of the leaf and the petiole or the leaf stalk. We have the internode, just basically the part of the stem between the axillary buds or the leaf or the branches. We have the nodes themselves, which are basically where the axillary buds or the branches come out of the main stem. And of course, we have the stem itself, the main trunk or stem of the tree or plant, right? Now, there are three major types of plant cells. So in these plant cells, we have the first one, the parenchyma. These are functional cells. These are literally the cells that do stuff in your plant. So they have very thin cell walls. They can divide into different types, so they can differentiate, and therefore the repair, photosynthesis, storage, secretion, buoyancy, again, many, many different functions. So that's your parenchyma. They function. Now, your parenchyma, there are special types. We have the chlorenchyma. From the name itself, it's parenchyma with lots of chloroplasts. You can see it's very green. And we also have aerenchyma, Aerencyma. Aerenchyma are basically parenchyma with air bubbles inside of them that are for the buoyancy of your plant tissue. Next, we have our collenchyma. These are the soft support cells. So they help support your plant. So your collenchyma have uneven cell walls. So their cell walls are thick in some parts and thin in others because this allows your growing parts of the plant to grow in a flexible manner. So they give support and structural integrity, but they're still flexible because there are parts of them that have thin cell walls. So in a growing part of the plant, you need this so that they can still adjust to the growing parts. Next, we have the sclerenchyma. If collenchyma is the soft support, sclerenchyma is the hard support cells. So you can see in this picture that they have very thick cell walls, and they're usually dead when they're fully mature because the cell walls are just too dang thick. So they're hardcore, they produce very hard structural integrity and protection. So usually this is in the outer layers of your plant. Now we move on to the major types of plant tissues. So different parenchyma, sclerenchyma, and collenchyma being mixed together can turn into different types of plant tissues, now with their own specific functions and roles. So your epidermal tissue is the outer covering of the plant. So sclerenchyma plays a large part in this type of tissue, but there's also parenchyma in it. So it protects against water loss, regulates gas exchange, secretes substances, and absorbs water and nutrients. So part of your epidermal tissue is the cuticle. It's a shiny film of carbohydrates and lipids that prevents water loss. It also lets water slide off the leaf and fall to the ground where the roots can take in the water and any other dissolved materials in the water that the plant may need. So the cuticle is basically the shiny part of the leaf, usually on the top. Trichomes, on the other hand, are very, very small microscopic growths that perform many different functions. If you have a plant that seems kind of rough around the edges of the stem or the leaf, this is usually because of trichomes. So they have different functions depending on their shape. So again, here are some pictures of some trichomes. Some of them are for defense, like this one. It looks like a spike So it's probably for defense against herbivory. These ones, they are smaller spikes. They're not big enough to actually defend against herbivory, but they're probably to increase surface area and make water stick more to that part of the plant. This one is usually most likely for secretion of certain substances, as well as most of the others. So different plants can secrete plant hormones. They can secrete poisons or toxins to defend themselves from predators. So there's many different functions for trichomes. So the tiny pores or openings on the leaves are called stomata. These are pores that are flanked by guard cells. So they regulate the gas exchange and water exchange with the environment of the plant. So they look like this. When your guard cells are swole, when they have lots of water, it's open. That allows it to exchange water with the environment. So it can allow water to go out. And when there's not enough water, your guard cells shrink and close the pore of the stomata. So there are many other factors that can determine the opening and closing of stomata, but mostly it's determined by the water levels in your guard cells. Next is your vascular tissue. So this ensures that food and water is delivered to all the cells of the plant, whether it's a giant tree or a tiny, tiny plant, except for the non-vascular plants, which we might get to in systematics. So there's two types of vascular tissue. We have the xylem for water transport and the phloem for food transport. So in your xylem and phloem, they're basically just tubes inside your plant. So this is a section of the plant where you can clearly see the xylem and the phloem. So your xylem is for water transport. One way to remember it is that the xylem sips water from the ground through the roots and up the tree or the plant. So there's two cell types for your vascular tissue, your xylem. We have the vessel elements and the tracheids, both of which are sclerenchyma, meaning they're dead, very thick cells. This is because the water pressure can tend to be very, very high, especially in very large trees. So your tracheid is basically your long and narrow form of the xylem cell, whereas your vessel element is the short and stout form of your xylem cell. On the other hand, your phloem is for food transport. So one way to remember it is that phloem stands for food. Food. So it transports dissolved organic molecules like sugar in the form of glucose. And there's two cell types. Again, there's the sieve tube elements this time and the companion cells, both of which need to be alive or living cells. They are types of parenchyma because they need to be able to transport these organic molecules in an active way. So it performs active transport. So your sieve and companion cells look like this. This is the cross section on the left. So if you cut the plant across the stem, so if this is the stem, you just cut it like that. This is what you'll see. The sieve tube member is literally by its name a member of a very long sieve tube. Whereas the companion cell is a cell that's just on the sides of the sieve tube member cell so that it can support that sieve tube member. So what happens is that the sieve tube member cells form a very long tube with sieves between them in order to um, it's basically a sieve. It's like a filter for the sieve tube. Now your companion cells are on the outside or on the periphery of your sieve tube member cells in order to give them the metabolic power that they need, because the sieve tube members, if you look at them, they're very thin and lanky. They barely have any organelles inside them. So the cellular structures that are necessary to keep the sieve tube members alive are in the companion cells. So they're full support. So again, the sieve tube element has very few organelles and cannot survive alone, but needs to be alive to pump solutes into and out of the cell, while your companion cell does the metabolism for both of them. So your companion cell has specialized plasmodesmata, okay, that allow it to, so you can see it here, the plasmodesmata, the holes in the cell wall that are specialized so that they can easily transport materials. So what about the fleshy bits of a plant? If it's not on the outer covering or the tubes that transport food and water, we have the ground tissue. So the ground tissue is responsible for the horizontal transport of food and water and for photosynthesis. So we have three types: the pith, the cortex, and the mesophyll. The pith is like the inner part of the stem or the root. So the inner part is responsible for storage and transport of your food and water. So in dicots, it's seen only in the stem. For monocots, it extends all the way to the roots. Okay, so again, in two different classifications or categories of plants, we see different structures in different parts of the systems of the plant. So again, in dicots, it's seen only in the shoot system. In monocots, it's both in the shoot and the root. So your pith is one example of your pith is your tapioca pith. The tapioca starch is harvested from the pith, so the sago in your tapioca balls. So that's part of the pith of the palm plant. It's actually poisonous in its raw state. It has to be processed in order for us to be able to eat it. So fun, right? The cortex, on the other hand, is another type of ground tissue which forms a ring of parenchyma cells above the vascular systems but beneath the epidermis. It's for storage and transport between the vascular and the epidermal system. So to show you what I mean, this is the cortex now. The cortex is again between the vascular systems on the inside and the epidermal tissue on the outside. So it's like a sandwiched layer. So the cortex is responsible again for storage and transport. Next, we have the mesophyll. So this is the third type of ground tissue. So this is the specialized tissue for photosynthesis found in leaves. So if we zoom in on a leaf, again, we have the cuticle and the epidermis for your epidermal tissue. Your mesophyll is composed of the palisade and spongy mesophyll underneath the epidermal tissues. So again, we have two types, the palisade and the spongy mesophyll. You can see that the palisade mesophyll is very tall and very thick. The spongy mesophyll has a lot of space between them. So this is in relation to their function. Okay. So again, the palisade and spongy mesophyll. Your palisade mesophyll is tall and tightly packed because its function is to capture sunlight for the photosynthetic process. So since they're tightly packed and tall, light cannot easily pass through them without, it being captured by their pigments in the chloroplasts. The spongy mesophyll, on the other hand, is mostly for providing intercellular space or space for air to be in the leaf. This is so that there's air for gas exchange. So you need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, so you need gas exchange. So the spongy mesophyll allows for that. So how do plants grow? So we know that plants grow, especially grass, it grows very quickly. So in what ways or directions can grass grow? So grass can grow due to meristematic tissue. So this is basically tissue made of dividing undifferentiated cells. So this means that they're cells with lots of potential. So the division of the cells causes the growth of the plant. So there's three types of meristematic tissue. There's apical, lateral, and intercalary. So apical meristematic tissue is on the tips of the plant, the tips of the roots and the tips of the shoots. So apical meristematic tissue is for the growth of the plant upwards and downwards. So your apical meristematic tissue, there's two types, shoot and root apical meristem, literally going up or going down. So the meristem is on the tips of roots and shoots. They're responsible for what's called primary growth, the height and the depth of the plant. So this is the diagram for your root and shoot apical meristems. You can see the micrographs of your shoot and root apical meristems. We can see very dense clusters of very small undifferentiated cells on the very tips of your root and your shoot apical meristem. On the root, you can see that there's this boundary between this thing and the inner very compact cells. The boundary here is called the root cap. So it's made of sclerenchyma. That's just to protect the living parts of the root. So your lateral meristem is the second type of meristem, and it's found on the sides of the plant. It's responsible for secondary growth, how girthy or thick your plant can get. So it's mostly found on trees. So we have cork cambium and vascular cambium as the types of lateral meristematic tissue. So what are these? If we look at the cross-section of a tree, we have some tree rings, and these tree rings represent some of these lateral meristematic tissue. So we have the vascular cambium, which produces the phloem, the xylem, and we have your cork cambium, which produces the cork, or the part of the bark of the tree. So your vascular cambium, your cork cambium, let's start with the cork cambium, again produces cork. So in cork boards, that's mostly cork from the oak tree. So the cork cambium creates cork, which adds to the epidermis. It's a protective material for your plant, or mostly your trees. Your Vascular cambium, on the other hand, creates the xylem on the inner side and phloem on the outer side. So water flows on the inner side of the vascular cambium, and food flows on the outer side of the vascular cambium. So it's a ring that's bordered by the pith and the cortex, so the pith on the inside and the cortex on the outside, and it's only present in dicots. Dicots like trees. Monocots like grass usually lack secondary growth. So, grass doesn't grow thicker usually. So this is a cross-section of your dicot on the left and your monocot on the right. We can see that in your dicot, your vascular cambium is in bundles. That's like a ring, forms an interrupted ring in your dicot. In your monocots, on the other hand, your vascular bundles are in literal bundles. They're just bundles of joy, like actual clumps of tubes and cells in different parts of the monocot stem. So again, very different uh, structures in your monocot and dicot, even though they perform the same function. Next, another example of your vascular bundles. This is the cross-section of a grass leaf blade. You can see the vascular bundles look very happy. So the vascular cambium in this case are the thin layer of clumped cells here, undifferentiated. We have the xylem, the big tube, and the phloem, the small tubes. So it looks like a happy face. Your tree rings in your dicots are actually a form of secondary xylem made by your vascular cambium. So it makes one ring every year. So these are called annular rings because they form every year. So again, they are secondary xylem. So looking at your grass grows very, very, very fast, even if you cut the very tips of the grass using a lawnmower or something like that. So how do they grow when their apical meristem has been cut? So grass gets cut or eaten regularly. So if the shoot tips keep getting eaten, how do they keep growing back? That's because of the intercalary meristem. So this is only found in monocots like grass, and that's why they can grow very fast. So this is meristematic tissue found in the middle of the plant at the internodes or at leaf bases. So since there's multiple nodes in a stem of a plant and there's multiple places where you have intercalary meristem, this allows for quick regrowth or regeneration of the plant itself. So again, only present in monocots. So now we've discussed 3 plant cell types and 4 major plant tissues, as well as the basic anatomy of a plant. Now we talk about the development, the growth, the function of the plant. So first we'll start off with, you'll have homework where your brainstorm activity is about drawing and labeling the root and stem cross-sections of monocots and dicots. But we'll get to that after this discussion. So plant reproduction is what we'll talk about next. So how do plants reproduce? So we have many types of plants. So we have seedless plants, so no seeds, just spores. We have gymnosperms, and we have angiosperms. For this discussion on plant reproduction, we'll focus on the angiosperms, the flowering plants. But just to give you a rounded out discussion, we're going to talk a bit about the alternation of generations of plants. So whether they're seedless plants, whether they're gymnosperms or angiosperms, all plants have an alternation of generations. We have the sporophyte generation, it's the diploid life of the plant, and the gametophyte generation, or the haploid life of the plant. So you can see in this diagram that for angiosperms, their haploid life is basically their seed form, and their tree life or plant life is their sporophyte form. Okay, for your sporeless plant, your seedless plants, they have a longer haploid life compared to their diploid life. So there's a difference in the length of their lifespan in different generations, whether it's sporophyte or gametophyte generation. But basically, they always alternate between haploid and diploid. Now, for your plants, sometimes they can have vegetative reproduction, meaning they don't have to have sex. They can just have asexual reproduction. This is the natural type. We have plantlets. For example, in your calancho plant can just have buds from leaves, literally just budding off from the leaves, little tiny calancho plants. Your tuber buds, like in your potatoes, are basically just how tubers that are specialized storage organs in plants can have buds themselves. Your rhizome buds are from your rhizomes that spread sideways underground, so like your ginger, and your stolon spreads sideways above the ground, like your strawberry. So again, different types of plants can sometimes reproduce asexually. They don't need no partner. Artificial ways to do this include grafting. You can graft one stem to another to confer faster growth and better resistance to certain pathogens. Plant cutting, so cutting apart the stem and planting it straight into the ground. Some plants can, you can do this with certain types of plants. And there's a special marketing, which is mostly in Asian regions. So we make the stem grow roots by cutting the epidermal tissue and then putting soil on it before cutting it and putting it into the ground. So this gives a greater chance of survival, and is also the reason why we have some fruit trees that are very small but already grow fruit within a year of planting. So marketed trees are like that. So what about sexual reproduction? How do plants do it? Again, focusing on angiosperms or flowering plants, we have, of course, the flowers and the fruits. So flowers are reproductive organs. They have male and or female parts. So in the flower, we have many parts. We have the corolla, which is just a group of petals, and the calyx, the group of sepals. And of course, your actual male and female reproductive organs. So the stamen is the male part of the flower. You can remember it because stamen. So it's composed of the anther and the filament. The anther holds the pollen grains, while the filament is just the stalk that holds the anther. So when you say they're staminate flowers, they only have a stamen. And the pollen serves as the male gametophyte. Okay, so again, it's the male holder of genetic material. On the other hand, you have the pistil, the female part of the flower. Sometimes it's also called the carpel. So pistillate flowers only have pistils, and we have three main parts: stigma, style, and ovary. The stigma catches the pollen, the style conducts it to the ovary, and the ovary eventually becomes the fruit. Ovules inside the ovary become the seeds and serve as the female gametophyte. So not all parts turn up in all flowers. Some flowers kind of lack some parts. Incomplete flowers lack at least one major part of the flower, for example, petals or sepals, or the stamen or pistil. Complete flowers would have, of course, everything because they're complete. But just because they're incomplete doesn't mean they're not enough. There are some types of flowers that are called perfect flowers that just need the male and the female parts. As long as there's a stamen and the pistil, it doesn't care about whether there's petals or sepals. They're perfect the way they are. Imperfect flowers just have one sex. They're pistillate or staminate. So monoecious plants have both staminate and pistillate flowers, meaning they don't need another plant individual in order to produce fruit, so they can self-pollinate. Dioecious, on the other hand, are plants that require two plants in order to reproduce. So they only have one sex per plant, so you need another plant individual for them to make fruits together. So only cross-pollination for dioecious. The one way to remember is monoecious, it only takes one for it to make fruit, and dioecious, it takes two for it to tango, or perhaps two to mango. Shut up, Ramon. So we know the parts, but what's the process of the plant reproduction? So first is pollination. Pollen must be brought to the pistil. So animals or wind act as pollinators. Self-pollination is the same plant, and cross-pollination is to a different plant. So take note, cross-pollination is a different plant, not necessarily just a different flower. So if the pollen is coming from the same plant but going to a different flower, it's still self-pollination. So double fertilization is what happens in plants. So what happens is that the male gametophyte combines with the female gametophyte, sperm and egg, creating a zygote, but there's also two polar nuclei. So if you remember your um, spermatogenesis and oogenesis, hopefully you remember that. There's polar nuclei that are usually wasted in animals. In plants, they are used to create the endosperm. So the endosperm is food for the dormant seed. All right. So there's a component there specifically so the seed has a good head start when it comes to food source. So it develops into seeds and then usually in fruits. So what's the point of fruits? Your seeds get to be armored by the fruit, and they themselves are armored transports as well. So there's a concept of seed dormancy where seeds will only germinate when there are good conditions for the plant. So they will remain dormant until there's enough water and enough minerals in the soil, for example. So fruits also help with seed dispersal. So if the fruits are yummy, animals will eat the fruits, usually spreading the seeds on their fur or taking the fruits elsewhere. So they can also be spread by wind, water, and even exploding fruit, just like in this GIF. So that's plant reproduction in a nutshell. That's plant signals, on the other hand, are how the plant is induced to grow or develop in different ways using different signals. So internal signaling is done through plant hormones. So plant hormone number one is the auxin. Your auxins, so it's a classification of plant hormones, they make the cell get longer. The plant cells get longer. So the one application of this is phototropism. Plants grow towards light. So how this happens is that when there's no sunlight on one side, auxins do not form very well. So since there's no auxins on one side and more auxins on the other, the cells elongate on the side with auxins, the one side that has uh, exposure to the light. So what happens is that your plant tends to bend towards where light is. That results in phototropism, or plants growing toward light. Plant hormone number two is cytokinins, or cytokinins. Potato, potato. So these are things that make cells divide. So alone, they don't do very much. They do make cells divide, but you can't see any actual functional differences except if you have a proper ratio to auxins. So the ratio between them determines a lot of stuff. For example, apical dominance is how your plants usually want to grow through primary growth, or growing taller and deeper rather than thicker. So you don't see very thick, stout trees unless they are pruned. So pruning is the decapitation of the apical tip, which removes a lot of the auxin producing cells in the apical bud. So that creates more cytokinins as compared to auxins, creating more lateral dominance, meaning there's more branches instead. So this is how you make this is the concept behind what do you call those? The tiny trees, the yeah, basically the tiny trees. We'll get to the term later on. Your root and your shoot production is also influenced by the ratio of auxins and cytokinin. So high auxin and low cytokinin produces more roots, while low auxin and high cytokinin produces more of the shoot of your plant. So moving on, we have plant hormone number three. We have gibberellins. These are hormones that make cells elongate and divide. They are important for stem elongation, fruit growth, and seed germination. Particularly for fruit growth, some species of grapes are sprayed with artificial gibberellins to make them grow larger for, better looking grapes for eating. So again, gibberellins do sort of both, but again, they don't rely on ratios. They can't produce the same kinds of different results that cytokinins and auxins can perform in different ratios together. Okay. Plant hormone number four is abscisic acid. This is a hormone that slows down growth. It's very important for seed dormancy and for the tolerance to drought. So seed dormancy is again basically just waiting for the proper moment to germinate. And drought tolerance is how your stomata can be opened or closed, controlled by this abscisic acid and other hormones. So it's not just the presence or absence of water, it's also dictated by hormones. Plant hormone number five is ethylene. So this primarily controls the maturity of your different plant structures. This is important for physical obstacles, senescence, leaf abscission, and fruit ripening. When we say physical obstacles, just like shown in this image here, if there's an obstacle to your plant, it tends to grow thicker, a thicker stem, and grows off to the side and then flips back. This is so that it tries to circumvent the obstacle that is in its way. All right, so that's due to ethylene. Another thing that it controls is senescence, or how old certain structures get. When some structures get old, they tend to fall off, like very old leaves. They're more of a liability than of help, so they get uh, wrinkled and die off. Leaf abscission is an example of how ethylene can control leaves, so they can be prematurely uh, they can prematurely fall even though they're not old yet. This is very important for your temperate plants that have that live in places with 4 seasons. So during fall or autumn, leaf abscission is when the leaves fall off because they are no longer helpful during the winter season. So it's again determined by ethylene, and fruit ripening is also done by ethylene, which is why putting fruits together in a covered container help them ripen faster, especially apples and bananas. So external stimuli, on the other hand, is how the environment can influence the plant's growth and development. So one example, one stimulus is light or the absence of it during the night. So phototropism, we already discussed that plants grow towards the light, but photoperiodism is basically how some plants have a critical length of night for blooming. So this results in very seasonal flowers. Some flowers only bloom when you have a critical nocto period or critical night length. If you disrupt that critical night length with flashes of light, or if there's longer days still, then your plant will not bloom. So again, photoperiodism, it's more important in places with more than 2 seasons. Next stimulus is gravity. So we have gravitropism. It's how plants tend to grow upward. The plant shoots tend to grow upward away from gravity, and plant roots tend to grow toward gravity or downward. So even if you bend the plant over, it tries to right itself up. So that happens actually due to auxins being influenced by gravity, right? So next stimulus is touch. We have thigmotropism, which is when a plant grows straight unless it touches something, triggering a coiling response. Excuse me. You can see in this GIF that this plant, it's probably a relative of the cucumber plant, so it spins a straight growing stalk until it hits a physical obstruction upon which it coils around. So that's thigmotropism. Something very different but similar is nastic movement. Again, this is not thigmotropism. It's a very rapid movement responding to touch. So one example is your Venus flytrap. Another example is Mimosa pudica or your macahiya. So when you touch them, they have a very rapid response, usually in movement of the plant, so that they can defend against herbivores, or in the case of the Venus flytrap, perform predation. So next, yes. So plants can adapt. We have to be adaptable as well. So there's many different plant structures that have many different functions that allow them to thrive even if they can't move around in their environment. So if they, who cannot move around, can adapt to their environment, then we, as people, as humans, should be able to do that as well. Even if we can't move around in this quarantine period, we should be able to adapt and create new functions for ourselves. So that's pretty much it for this session, and I'll see you guys next time.
That is over.